Hello and welcome to this webinar on no-code secured forms in modern lists. My name is Peter Baddeley and I'll be taking you through this webinar today. I'm going to talk about Conformed and specifically focus on how they now work in modern list environments in SharePoint. So there's not going to be too much PowerPoint today because one of the great things about all of their products, but also today Conformed, is that I can show you it. They're very easy and quick to build out solutions on SharePoint and Office 365, today focusing primarily around forms. But I just wanted to set the scene briefly around forms in SharePoint. I'm a consultant, so some of the problems and challenges which I face and organizations face around working with forms in SharePoint. And so I just called out a few of the key ones here, which are things like changing the layout of the form. So actually, when you create a form in SharePoint Modern Lists, it's just a long list of fields. And I'll show you an example of one in a second. So actually being able to lay out those forms, being able to link to other data. So whether that's doing things like interrelated drop-down fields, I select a customer and I see a list of their contacts in my form. Or even being able to show and have multiple related items. So the whole header and footer, order header, order lines, employee assets they operate, customer and the products they have, customer and the cases they've logged. There's lots of requirements around being able to relate data together, and there's not an easy way to do that within SharePoint. Other things which I'm often asked about with forms is being able to do simple things like validation and business rules. So being able to say and ensure that data in an email field or a telephone number or a credit card field or whatever it might be is entered into a correct format. And also being able to not actually show 25 fields at once, but actually being able to show them at the right point in my process, or maybe only optionally show them if certain bits of data are set. All the sort of things you'd expect in a forms-based product. So being able to say, well, if the option to this is yes, show these fields. If the option is no, hide them. Or, for example, if I set this value to be over this, then this field is required. So being able to do that sort of logic, even being able to only show fields to certain users. And then finally being able to do really sort of simple workflow-like actions. I'm not talking about your really complex workflow processes. Being able to do simple things like send an email or create an item in another list. All of these sort of things are requirements which end users have to be able to just sort of enhance their existing form requirement. And it's not easy to do in SharePoint. Now, previously and historically, we'd have used InfoPath. Wasn't necessarily an easy application to use, but InfoPath's life is running out. It hasn't been enhanced for many years, so it isn't really a suitable solution, especially in the modern interface. Now, Microsoft will maybe suggest that you want to look at Power Apps, and some of you may be using Power Apps. Personally, I find Power Apps quite complicated to get started with. You have to understand a lot of the syntax around the formulas. I find it quite clunky to use, and even when I'm using it, I have to wait for that quite long load screen to load up my form. It just doesn't feel like a forms application which a non-technical user can use. And also, there's the cost around Power Apps. Those of you who follow some of the Microsoft discussions going on will know that a lot of the licensing has changed around Power Apps recently. So there's a lot of unknown and risk associated with doing something in Power Apps. So that's really where Conformed comes in. It's an application and an app which you can install into Office 365, and it allows us to very quickly customize a SharePoint list form and add a lot of functionality, which is what I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to come out of PowerPoint and I'm going to switch over to my browser, and I'm going to show you my starting point, then I'm going to show you my end point, and then I'm going to show you how I get from the start to the end. So I've got a SharePoint site here. You can see it's using the modern experience. I'm going to focus on the modern experience today because Conformed now works and supports the modern experience, but this also does work with classic interface as well, so if you're still using the classic interface. I've got a few lists and libraries in this site. So I've got an employee list here. If I go here and create a new item in my list, you can see a standard SharePoint form here. So asking for some text fields, some yes/no fields, some dates. I see all the fields at once. There's no real ability to show fields in different orders dependent on certain conditions. Also, I want to show data from other lists. So I've got a offices list here where I'm managing my different offices which my employee could be based in. So I'd quite like to look up the data from that list, but I'd also like to look up the locations in that office. So say someone works in the New York office, well, I want to be able to easily define what floor it is. So I've got a list here which relates my office to my location. There's not really an easy way. Yeah, I can do one lookup into my SharePoint list, into my SharePoint employees form, but I can't do multiple lookups interdependent without writing some sort of JavaScript or something else like that myself. And then I've also got a list of assets. So here are the different assets which I want to record. So IT equipment, mobile phones, and I'm capturing things like its name, the type of asset, serial number, date it was assigned, and value. I want to enter multiple assets. So I want to come in here and be able to add in multiple assets, and I want to associate them with an employee. But I don't really want to have to do that in a separate list. I want to do that all as part of my one employee list. Now, I think pretty much using any other solution, something like this would involve engaging a developer or a consultant or purchasing a very expensive third-party tool. And it's not something which I can put together within a sort of 10-15 minute demo, which is what I'm going to demonstrate to you now. Firstly, let me show you the endpoint though. So let's just switch over to another site because I've got one which I've already created. Same setup, but I come here and I create a new item in my employees list. And I get a form come up which is not like a regular SharePoint form because I'm using Conformed to enhance that form. So I've got my fields laid out in multiple columns. I've got, and we'll start entering a piece of data, so we'll use Nimrod, who works at Quizcom, and I can go and look up his office location, so I can say Toronto, and I can see that my locations are restricted based on which location, which office I'm selecting. I can even do things like validation. So if I just go and put any old nonsense in, it won't let me save that because it will say, please enter a valid email address. So I'll make sure that we put a valid email address in there. And I'm also doing things like being able to show and hide fields based on certain conditions. So I've got a field here saying, has the training been completed or not? If I tick that, it will actually show me the date field. So only showing me information when I want to actually complete it. And what's more, I've also got the ability to add associated records. So I can come in here and manage my table of assets. And let's say we've given him an iPhone. I can very quickly build up a table of information, still populating my associated list, but doing it in a way where I can easily add or remove rows. And if I save that item now, it's going to go back in and populate my SharePoint list with that record. And I can go and view that in my customized form. And I can also go and have a look at my associated list. So I can see that, for instance, my assets are populated with the details of those individual assets. And it could be more than one associated with a specific person. So let me show you how I've put some of that together. And let's go back to my sort of starting site where I've just got nothing set up. Now, for speed, I've already installed the QuizCom app. You can either install this from the SharePoint store, or you can add it to your app catalog. And if I click here and go to Conformed, I've then got a range of different options which I can use to customize how my form behaves. Firstly, I can work on the form layout. So instead of just having that list of fields, I can design and control the behavior of my form. And it's quite nice, it's quite easy to use, it's quite intuitive to use. So there's some basic settings at the top here defining how the field captions and descriptions are displayed. And I can also define the number of fields for each row I'm going to add. So I'm going to say I want 2. And there's a couple of presentation options, and these will make sense in a minute. What we're doing is we're creating groups of fields. So grouping the fields together into either tabs or an accordion style. So I quite like the tab style. Other people like the other style, and I'll show you the difference in a second. So I'm giving my group a name. So let's call it employee details. And I'm saying I'm going to have 2 columns here. And then very simply, and I can adjust this if I want. I can say I'd like 3. I can say I'd like 1. And very simply, I can then go and start to add fields to my layout. So I can go and say, well, actually, I'd like employee name. And employee name could be quite long. So we'll adjust that to be over 2 columns. And then I want employee number. And I want email address. Now that's just going to get me going with a very basic setup. And I'll do a lot more work here as we move through. I'm just going to save this. So I just want to show you immediately what we've done here. And if we go back now to my employees list, and we click on new, oh, accidentally clicked on quick edit there. If I click on new, you'll immediately see I've got a layout slightly more designed towards my requirements. And the key thing there is you saw it create a little tab, and I'll explain a bit more about the tabs as we go through. So what next? I've added a couple of form fields and I've laid that out. That's sort of quite useful. But next thing I want to show is that ability to add my office and location field. So to do that, I need to go to cascading lookup columns. So this is another QuizCom product which you can either buy on its own or as part of QuizCom Forms. And I want to create a new column and I want to give it a name. So firstly, I'm going to add a column for office. So think of this as like a very advanced lookup field. And I'll say, well, what list do I want to look at? I want to look at my offices list. And I'm looking at the column called Office in that list. Now, there's some really nice things here, like being able to filter based on a specific view. So you could say, well, actually, if I have a field against my list which says there if that office is active or not, only let me pick from the offices which are active. So some great ways to have a lookup list, but restrict the options in that lookup list. Now I'm just going to hit apply here, because I then want to create another field. So I want to then create a field for my location. So that one's been set up, and then I want to create a new column. So I'm going to create one called location. In this case, I'm going to go and look at my location list. And I'm going to look at my different filtering options. And in this case, I want to filter based on another column, because I want to filter based on the selection of office to then restrict my options for location. So I'm going to filter based on office. And I'm going to only show items where the office, so the office it equals office. It's a pretty simple way of sort of filtering those across. So I'm defining the filter field in my employees list, matching to a filter field in my locations list. And I'm going to go and hit save here. So I've set those two fields up, and now I'm going to add them to my form. So to do that, I go back into the Quiz Conforms app. And I just go and add those fields through form layout. So I'm going to add office, and I'm going to add location. And now while we're here, we'll add a couple of extra fields for my training fields. So I'm going to firstly add a little divider, because actually I want to divide up. This is my core data. I don't want to create another group or another tab, but I do want to sort of just put a little heading in here. So to do that, I can either use a horizontal line or I can use a text cell. So I'm going to select a text cell. I'm going to span it across two columns. And then I'm just going to give a heading called training completed. Yeah. And then I'm going to add a field saying, has my IT training been completed, and the date. And I'm going to add a field for safety training completed and the date. And I'm going to apply that and save it. Now, I'll show you this, and then we'll start to add some additional logic to our form. So we'll just go and show and see what the new item looks like now. We can see I've got my little heading here which I've added, and I've got my training fields down there. We'll come back to those in a second. And I've got my office and location field. If I go and select my office now, so I go and select London, I'm only restricted to two options. If I select New York, I'm restricted to two options. So very quickly, I've started to build up a form with a custom layout, and I've also added some cascading drop-down fields. Now, I challenge most people to go and find another solution which you could do that in the space of about 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, so let's now add a bit more logic to it. Let's hide these fields if these are ticked to no, and let's put some validation around my email. And also, some of these words are a bit wordy, so we'll go and modify those, because that was one of the features which I asked QuizCom to do, and I quite like that feature. So I'll go and show you that feature which I was involved in delivering. So let's go back into QuizCom forms, and I'm going to show you a few different pieces here. So firstly, I'm going to show you how you can put in alternative names, aliases for certain fields. So if you go into form layout, now we've got a heading for our section already which says training completed, and maybe I want to make that heading a bit bigger, so we'll make it a bit bigger. And I'm now coming up here to field aliases. Now I don't really need it saying IT training completed, so I'm just going to have it say IT, and then when it's training date there, I'm going to put completed date. Yeah, and I'm going to do the same for safety training. So just putting some labels which are relevant for the user. So just a bit of nice presentation. And then I'm going to have a little look at some validation. So the first one is field constraints. So ensuring that data is entered in a manner which we want. Now we could do an entire webinar just on this option. And if I select this field like employee email, I can then start to apply different rules about how I want the data to be entered and what I want to happen if it's not entered correctly. So I can enter here a new rule and say, if it's equal to this, do this. If it's not equal to this, do this. But my favourite option is actually matches pattern, because QuizCom have defined a whole number of patterns which you can pre-use, or you can set your own. So I've got some great options here to use for patterns. Is it a valid website address? Is it a valid zip code? And I'm going to choose the one for email address. And then I'm going to give a little error message saying, please enter a valid email. And what's great, you can choose to highlight the field, which I will do. And I can also put a condition which it occurs on. So I could say, well, only when it doesn't contain, or when it's, when it's not this condition, when it's not that condition. So lots of options there. I'm quite happy with that, so I'm just going to apply that rule. And everywhere throughout the system, we can control how things occur based on conditions. The next thing I want to do is show or hide fields based on certain conditions. So I only want to show the training completed dates when it's been ticked as yes. So to do this, we go to dynamically show hide fields. And I select a column. So I select a column I want to apply the rule against. So I go and say IT training completed. And I go and add a new rule. And the great thing here is I can apply those to different forms. So I might want the behavior to work differently on the new form versus the edit form. A great scenario for that is one of my customers which use QuizCom forms, where they don't want a number of fields to show on the new form, so they just hide them. So I'm going to say, this is actually going to apply all the new or edit field. We can then say what we want it to do. So we can say whether we want it to show the field, hide the field, or disable the field. So I'm going to say, in this case, I'm going to do the when it's not yes condition. So I'm going to say I want to hide the field. And I'm going to say when I'm doing IT training complete. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this on the wrong field. I should be doing this on IT training date. So let me just switch to the other field. Oh, let me just switch to the other field. So I'm running this on IT training date, and I'm selecting my new and my edit field. I'm choosing to hide that field, and my condition is based on IT training. And if that is equal to no, then I want it hidden. So I'm running this rule against the IT training date. I'm running it on my new and edit form, and I'm hiding that field if IT training is equal to no. And I'm going to do the same for my safety training date. And I'm going to add a rule, and I'm going to hide based on that condition. I wanted to call out one thing while you're here as well. Another thing you can do is use current user. And you can either go current user is equal to, or you can go in, which is a great option. So you can actually go and check if a user is a member of an Active Directory group. That's another feature my customer uses, where they only allow certain people to edit certain fields. That's a really neat and simple way of implementing that requirement. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select safety training completed is equal to no. So very quickly I've built up some validation around my form. And I'll just quickly show you that, and then I'll show you the last thing which I'm going to cover in the demo today, which is how we add that repeating table in there. So let's just go back to my employees list. And I'm going to click on new. You'll now see that those date fields aren't presented. So ticking those options shows those fields. And if I go and put in some nonsense, it will ask me to enter a valid email address. So I've immediately applied some validation. So the last thing I'm going to cover in the demo today is how I display my assets list in my form as well. And I'm also going to show you as part of this how I add another group, or in my case a tab, to my form as well. So to do this I use the Repeating Rows app. Like the Cascading Forms app, you can purchase this on its own or as part of a Conformed purchase. So I'm going to create a new column. Essentially what we're doing is we're creating a column in my list, but we're allowing it to then repeat a table essentially. So what am I going to call this? I'm just going to call it assets. So I need to give my column a name. And there's a few options here. How many rows do I want to appear straight away? So I could have a number of lines here. I only want one because I'm going to add one asset at a time, but bear in mind I could add multiple. Let's actually say two so you can see that action happening. I can add some text to define, well, what is the add option? So we could add new rows, add new assets, add new item, whatever you want here. It's just a little text helper to add those items. I'll point that out to you as we get into it. And then let's select a target list. So where's the list which we're basically going to be inserting these items into? Let's select assets. And then we define what columns do we want in that list. So I'm going to say and select all of my columns in the order which I want to select them. And very neatly, it then presents how you want that to look. So you can see the columns laid out. I can see 2 rows are going to be added. I can see I've got my add row option. And I've even got options here to control the width or present totals of those individual columns as well. So lots of flexibility. I also wanted to call out that you can also put documents in here as a repeating table. So you could have a repeating row of documents within your form and require users to upload a number of associated documents, even file those documents into certain folders. So lots of flexibility around documents as well. I'm going to hit save here. And what this is going to do is create me a field, a repeating row field within my employees list. And the last step I need to then do is go and add that to my form via Conformed. So let's go into Conformed. And go to Form Layout. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another group here. So I'm going to go new group. Because I want this to appear, in my case I'm using tabs rather than accordions. I want that to appear on a different tab to break up my form. So I'm going to go and put this and call this assets register. I'm going to say I want 1 row per column, so I don't need this extra row. And then I'm going to select my column, and notice I've got a column called assets. That's my repeating row field. The other thing I wanted just to show you here is I can apply conditions here. So I can apply conditions over when that tab is shown. So it could be, for instance, on a certain state. So maybe when a field only equals a certain value, that tab is shown. Or even when the current user is member of a security group, so you can hide a whole tab from certain users. So lots of flexibility around presentation. Let's save this, and then I'll just show you that form in action, and then we'll have a chance for a brief summary and an opportunity to ask any questions. So let's just navigate back to my employees list. And I'll click on new. And you can see here I've got 2 tabs now, employee details, assets register. And if I go into here, I've then got my repeating row table set up. I've got 2 items automatically added to that. It's picking up all the things like choice fields and everything else like that defined in my other list. And I can go in and add and remove rows. And that will continue to work when I come back to this and then save it and then add additional rows after it's been created. So in this brief demo, to briefly summarize, what have I shown you? I've shown you how to change the layout of a form. So I've shown you how to add fields across different tabs or groups. I've shown you how to do cascading fields. I've shown you how to implement validation on the way data is entered, or that fields are only shown under certain conditions. And I've also shown you how to add a repeating table. Now there's a lot I haven't shown you, and that's because there's a lot we can do, but we want to try and keep it, not take up your whole day. So I've not shown you things like the activities and actions, where I can trigger things like an email or a task being created. I've not shown you all the different varieties of validation which you could apply and a variety of the different rules. But there's a lot of capability here. So to wrap up, I just wanted to cover a few key points. Firstly, a bit of a technical point, but an important one. Quiz Conformed doesn't replace SharePoint forms, it's enhancing it. It's just enhancing that form layer. It's not a replacement of your form. And really importantly is that Quiz Conformed is the only solution implemented as a SharePoint hosted app. So what we're doing here is running client-side code in the browser to customize that appearance of the form and deliver all that functionality. Now, why is that important? Because the data doesn't go off somewhere else. It doesn't go off to a form solution which is hosted in another vendor's Azure instance or something else like that. So there's no risk of that data being stored in any manner outside of your tenant, which is very important in the world of data privacy and how data is managed across countries and even different geolocations as well. So a really important benefit of Quiz Conformed. It's your data, it's managed within your Office 365 tenant. All they're doing is giving you the ability to present that SharePoint form in a different manner. So why do I like Quiz Conformed? Why do I think this is a really great tool? Firstly, it's not InfoPath or Power Apps. I found both of those tools are quite complicated to use. If you know what you're doing, yes, you can deliver a form solution, but firstly, not quickly. And you do require a certain level of technical knowledge to be able to do that. Quiz Conforms is designed for non-technical business users, end users, to be able to customize forms within their sites. It works with both classic and modern experiences. And you can buy those components individually. So if you just want the cascading field component, you can just buy that individually. I'd urge you to look at the whole solution because it offers so many benefits. And actually, it's very low cost, whether that be you want to implement it for just an individual site collection, so just for a single purpose. If you're just an owner or site collection administrator of a specific site and you want to just enhance your form and you've got some budget to be able to deliver that, then it's great for that purpose. But it can also be deployed across your tenant for multiple different form scenarios. And I use this, I've used Quiz Conforms with a number of my customers, and it can go from very simple to quite complex solutions, and that's what's great about the tool. So that's it from me, and thank you. Hopefully there's been a few questions coming in, and so I will ask those questions out, and hopefully we'll either be able to ask them or push them over to the product team who will then be able to come back to you specifically. Thank you for watching this QuizCon webinar. If you have any further questions, please contact QuizCon using the details shown on screen.